Well, my least favorite kind of weather is wind and rain. So, yeah, it's been kind of difficult these past few weeks. In between hearing everyone say that this is the coldest, wettest winter in decades, I have found myself longing for the sun and warmth of Arizona, from whence I came. Oh, to be back where we never needed a coat. Shorts were regular, daily attire, and nothing but sandals ever covered my feet. Enough already of this cold, windy, rainy weather. And snow? I thought I left that behind years ago in Michigan. It's interesting how we remember things, isn't it? Especially during times of challenge and hardship. We tend to remember only the good that was left behind. You'll notice that in my musings, in my desire for what was, I didn't long for the heat of the summer. The record 53 consecutive days in the summer of 2020 when temperatures topped 110. No, I'm not yearning for that at all. In fact, I wasn't even remembering that this week. The Israelites had selective memory also. They'd just been miraculously delivered from danger through the waters of the Red Sea, where they narrowly escaped the Egyptians. They'd been saved by God and pointed towards the promised land. And in very, very short order, they already began to complain. They decided they would rather return from whence they came rather than marching on with Moses. Now, Moses had led the Israelites in the wilderness, and now they were parched with no water in sight. And when they finally did find water, it was bitter and undrinkable. But God stepped in. God sweetened the water to satisfy their thirst. Not only that, but God provided an oasis with an abundance of water and even some shade. You can read about this in Exodus 15, the chapter just prior to our reading this morning. In Elim, they discovered 12 springs of water and the welcome sight of 70 palm trees. Abundant and gracious provision by God who assured them, I am the Lord who heals you. From Elim, they set out again, making their way into the wilderness of Sin. And here, in the very midst of the wilderness of Sin, it was there that the whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron, their fearless leaders who have helped save them from sure and certain death. I'm not sure it's an accident, their location in the wilderness of Sin. But what is their complaint? What in the world could they have to grumble about? I mean, aside from having to wander through the wilderness for 40 years, but at this point in time, at the beginning of their journey, when they've just started out, one might think they'd actually be grateful for that divine deliverance rather than grumbling about what they don't have. It seems they've very quickly forgotten that they were actually slaves in Egypt. They have forgotten the oppression they suffered, the forced labor they endured, and the narrow escape that they just made. They are sentimentalizing their past to which they want to return. And it's an ancient version of a familiar refrain. Remember the good old days? The good old days when ... fill in the blank. We do this all the time in all sorts of ways, don't we? Remember the good old days when kids didn't have screens? The good old days when there was prayer in the public schools? The good old days when kids could play in the neighborhood till the streetlights came on and they knew it was time to come home for dinner? The good old days when we all weren't captive to these little mini computers in our pockets. But as another musician, Billy Joel, used to sing, the good old days weren't always good, and tomorrow ain't as bad as it seems. Now, fittingly, that song is entitled Keeping the Faith. You see, our memories are sometimes selective too. As one commentator on this Exodus passage notes, he wrote, battered by hunger and baked by the hot desert sun, the Israelites' memories begin to play tricks on them. In their minds, Egypt's house of bondage and land of death turns into some kind of tropical resort they want to return to. The Nile River, which was previously a place of death and danger, suddenly seems cool and sparkling. While Egypt was the place where the Israelites were so exhausted from all that forced labor that they hardly even had energy to eat, now they remember it, or maybe misremember it, as the land of never-ending, all-you-can-eat buffets. They don't seem to recall just how awful it was in Egypt, focused as they are on their current situation, which, to be fair, would certainly challenge the mettle of most of us. They've been delivered once through the sea. Can they trust God to deliver them through the desert too? Because that's what it always comes down to, doesn't it? Trust in God. And God does not abandon them. God provides for them. God feeds them, strengthens them, and nourishes them with the bread of heaven. God rains down upon them manna from heaven. It's an interesting image, isn't it, after the weather we've been having? Raining manna. If it's anything like the rain we've had, there must have been a lot of manna. And it was enough for everyone. God's provision was enough to be content. And that is what God had asked of them, to be content with what God had provided, to trust that it was enough and that it was just what they needed. Food for their journey, manna from heaven, the bread of life, our daily bread. God heard their grumbling, and rather than respond in anger, God responded in love. God provides abundantly. God provides always, in all kinds of ways, whether we are attuned to it or not. I wonder, do we, like the Israelites, look to the past through rose-colored glasses? Do we misremember the many, many challenges we faced even just a few years ago, let alone a decade or so ago? It's human nature, after all, to yearn for what was, especially as we face the challenges in the here and now. You may have even encountered this in the church. Many folks remembering and longing for the good old days, the 1950s when the pews were filled and families flocked to church, the 1980s when Christian music was on the rise and it felt maybe a little bit funky but also very faithful, the early aughts when everyone came together after the tragedy of 9/11 and our churches were full once again. But that remembering isn't the whole truth either. It doesn't capture the whole story. In previous times, attending worship or going to church, if you will, was the cultural norm. So many people were there for reasons other than to actually worship God. It may have been a family expectation. Maybe it was a great business opportunity, a chance to recruit clients, or in some instances, it was sort of an exclusive club mentality. But now, Now, in this post-Christian world in which we live, if you are here on a Sunday, like all of you are here this morning, it's most likely because you are actually seeking something spiritual, something sacred, an encounter with the living God, an opportunity to grow in faith, to become part of a faith community, a place where you belong and your faith can be nurtured and nourished and strengthened. Because the good old days weren't always good, and tomorrow ain't as bad as it seems. I think we have something to learn here from the Israelites. Let's not look to our past with too much sentimentality either. Let us focus on our future. Let us trust in God's provision and move forward together in hope, grateful for what God is already doing among and through this wonderful, faithful congregation. As the church, capital C, the church universal, it has been a wilderness season. The pandemic brought pandemonium, and it shook us to our foundation. To many church leaders, it felt a lot, an awful lot, like wandering through the wilderness in those early days and weeks and months of the pandemic. We all pivoted and adapted and worshiped in ways we never even dreamed of, online and in our cars and everything in between. Yes, we were shaken to our very foundation, but hopefully that helped us to remember our foundation, helped us to remember what and who that foundation is. Remember why we gather, to worship God and to serve God's people. We've all been through something significant. Church has changed. We've changed. Our past will not be our future. But that doesn't mean our future doesn't look bright. Exciting things are happening here. New ways of being church are emerging, and in many ways, I find that very encouraging, refreshing even. And I also acknowledge that it can certainly feel unsettling too, because we find comfort in the familiar, and we want our faith community to flourish. And we will, we are, because one thing won't change, and that is God's presence with us and God's provision for us. God has provided each one of us, each one of you, with gifts and talents, with much to offer in the service of Christ's ministry here in Santa Barbara. There is such an abundance of resources in this very room. You are all smart, interesting, talented, competent, capable people. You have gifts that God has given you to use for the coming of God's kingdom here on earth. You see, God gives each one of us, not so that we can keep that gift to ourselves, but so that God can use it, develop in it, use it to accomplish God's purposes in the world. And when we get weary and we feel like we too are wandering in the wilderness, God feeds us. God feeds us at the table. Just as God gave manna from heaven to the Israelites in their time of need, God gives us the bread of heaven and the cup of salvation. God gives us food for our journey, to strengthen us for the ministry to which God has called us, each one of us, woven together by God. So let us be filled, let us be grateful, and let us journey together into God's good future. Thanks be to God for the many, many ways that God makes a table for us, even in the wilderness. Thanks be to God. Amen.